Can everyone hear me? It seems to be on, but it's not working. Can you hear me now? No? That one was working before, so. There we go, perfect. I assume everyone can hear me now. Well, thank you very much to the Archer Blood Center, and thank you especially to my friend Kauser, and all the others associated with this event. Thank you for inviting me to speak. It's an honor, and it's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to have an excuse to get out of Washington for a few days, and particularly to come to New York, and especially when the weather is so unusually warm. So I have indeed been asked to speak on democracy in Bangladesh and how the US and the UN can help restore it. That was how it was put to me. Democracy is a delicate matter, and I think it's worth posing a key question off the bat. What is the status of democracy in Bangladesh these days? Because if you're talking about restoring it, that suggests that it's been removed or otherwise not there. Is this the case? But I think it's quite evident that democracy is very much imperiled in Bangladesh. And the nation certainly retains democratic structures. You've got a parliamentary democracy, you've got multiple political parties, you have an election planned fairly soon, but based on a whole range of democratic indicators, there's good reason to believe that democracy in Bangladesh is in a lot of trouble. And our earlier speaker, I think, highlighted a lot of the troubling signs. I'm not a democracy expert, so don't take my word for it, but let me cite the Freedom House, their latest Freedom of the World rankings. And Bangladesh is described as downward trending on freedoms because of, quote, increasing restrictions on critical journalists and censorship of media content, unquote. There's also talk in this report of, quote, sharp deterioration in the space for freedom of expression, with a lot of discussion of attacks on secular bloggers and others with progressive views. Bangladesh's scores in this report are not particularly impressive. Its ranking of political rights is 21 out of 40, political pluralism 9 out of 16, civil liberties 28 out of 60, rule of law 6 out of 16, so not particularly strong. I won't go into the political realities of Bangladesh these days and what this means for democracy, because I think this audience would have a better sense of that than me. But I'll just make one quick comment about one of the more, what I see as one of the more striking political trends in recent months in Bangladesh, and the troubling implications that this could have for democracy, among others. In the ruling party, the Awami League Party, an avowedly secular party, has had an increasing tendency to align itself with the views of the country's hardline Islamists on a number of policy issues. In June, for example, I don't have to tell the story, you all know about it, it briefly acceded to the demand of Hafez-e-Islam, a large Islamist activist group, to move a statue depicting Lady Justice away from the Supreme Court grounds in Dhaka because it allegedly offended Islam. Of course, the government eventually returned the statue to where it had been, but to a less prominent space. Now, one could argue in a hopeful light that this is good on one level, as it could bridge the deep divides between secularists and Islamists in Bangladesh. But I think there could perhaps be a bigger danger at play if the government keeps siding with the positions of the likes of Hafez-e-Islam. You risk imperiling democracy. Why do I say that? Hafez is obviously not a terrorist organization, nothing of the sort. But at times it espouses a retrograde, intolerant ideology revolving around harsh interpretations, which is the very ideology that tends to galvanize terrorist organizations. So I think the risk is that Dhaka, by refusing to distance itself from the ideas of Hafez, could indirectly legitimize the types of ideas that give rise to terror. And that's not good for democracy. So at any rate, now that I've established that democracy seems to be in need of restoration, that's just one example, let's critically examine this question of what can the US do to help restore democracy in Bangladesh. And let's be very candid here. I'm actually quite uncomfortable about the premise of this question, and particularly the notion of US assistance in restoring democracy in Bangladesh. So let's unpack this notion of democracy in Bangladesh and what the US or the UN could do to help restore it. First, I'll talk about myself, not because there's anything special about me. I'm just a think tank analyst in Washington, D.C., but I want to talk about where I'm from, or what I am. I'm an American, which means that my president is Donald Trump. Trump is, to put it mildly, not the greatest exemplar not the greatest exemplar of Jeffersonian democracy. That's my personal position. I'm not going to get into this too much, but let me just say that many Americans have expressed concern about some undemocratic tendencies in the Trump White House, from crackdowns on immigrants to the various short-lived travel bans, including one that was that just came out the other day, to intimidating behavior toward the media, among other things. So because I'm talking about democracy in Bangladesh, I risk being labeled a hypocrite, and for good reason, given my country and my leader. My country has, I think, experienced some considerable body blows to democracy over the last few months. The latest version of the Economic Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index, for the very first time, has downgraded the US rating from full democracy to flawed democracy. So for me, commenting on, especially critiquing Bangladeshi democracy could be a bit awkward and really a bit hypocritical as well. One could perhaps argue that an equally apt question to pose, though not tonight, is what can Americans do? What should Americans do to help restore democracy in America? But that's a discussion for another day. I profess deep skepticism about the idea of the US helping restore democracy in Bangladesh, and I say that for several reasons. First, and I'll be very candid here, I do not think that Bangladesh is a front burner issue for the Trump administration. I think it's at most a back burner issue, and quite frankly, it may not even be on the radar at all. For reasons that I don't need to explain to a group like this, that's very unfortunate. It's a shame. I mean, given Bangladesh's location, its geographic location, its status as a relatively moderate Muslim majority state, Bangladesh should be front and center in strategic considerations for Washington, but it's not, and it really has not been for quite a few years. I think it seems like the sad thing is that only when terrible things happen, when you have a mass casualty terrorist attack, or horrific flooding, or as we're seeing now, a very serious refugee crisis, only at those very difficult times does Washington seem to wake up to the realization that Bangladesh is very much there and very important. So the Trump administration hasn't really engaged all that much with Bangladesh. There have been encounters, there have been brief conversations, including a brief one here in this town at the UNGA not too long ago between Trump and Prime Minister Hasina, but all reports indicate that was not a particularly productive conversation. All this said, that there may be reason for hope that this administration will be a bit more attuned to Bangladesh, and that's because of one particular person who has already been mentioned here this evening. I was doing an interview with CNN right after that horrific terrorist attack at the Holy Bakery in the summer of 2016. And one of my main messages had been, in my interview, was that the Obama White House had ignored Bangladesh at its peril. It had taken its eye off the ball, even as radicalization was becoming more of an issue in Bangladesh, and US officials were not paying enough attention. So I was followed in that interview by none other than Lisa Curtis, who at the time was an extremely well-regarded South Asia analyst at the Heritage Foundation. And what Lisa said, I think, was very striking. She said, yes, I agree with Michael. We have not been paying enough attention to Bangladesh. Now, Lisa has always paid a lot of attention to Bangladesh. She'd been one of the very few DC think tank analysts who had really researched and written on the country in detail. And now, as we all know, she is the Senior Director for South Asia at the National Security Council at the White House. So maybe with Lisa managing South Asia policy in the White House, Bangladesh will get more attention there. But then again, she's just one person. Even though she's in a senior position, she's just one person. And when President Trump came out with his new strategy for Afghanistan and South Asia a few months back, he talked about Afghanistan. What other countries did he talk about? He talked about India, and he talked about Pakistan. I don't think he mentioned the word Bangladesh once in that somewhat long speech. Another reason I'm skeptical about this notion of the US helping restore democracy in Bangladesh is that the Trump White House does not really strike me as an administration that boldly embraces democracy promotion. This is an administration whose foreign policy really revolves around one singular goal: protecting American lives. I've heard senior Trump officials say this very explicitly in a number of closed-door meetings around town in Washington over the last few months. For the Trump administration, the overriding question guiding any foreign policy calculation is, what is in it for us? What is in it for America? What is in it for Americans? Now, according to this calculus, it makes good sense to emphasize counterterrorism in foreign policy because terrorists can threaten America. It makes good sense to reconsider trade arrangements that may not benefit the US economy and could threaten American jobs. This is, of course, what comes to it's never really been defined well, but we all understand as the America First philosophy. To be very frank, I don't see much that's America First about engineering a strong push for democracy in Bangladesh. The best way to get Trump's ear, I think, on democracy promotion in Bangladesh is if you were to invoke the T word, terrorism. You need to make an argument that democracy is the only bulwark against the onslaught of increasing Islamist terror and the empowerment of terrorists that could threaten the US. That could be a powerful argument, but is it a sound one? On some levels, perhaps, yes, because when you cut off channels for peaceful dissent, as the current government has been doing for a while, you increase the prospects for radicalization. But then again, I think we need to be clear. Bangladesh is not a particularly democratic place right now, and yet the terrorism threat, at least for now, seems to have abated. At least for now. There have been all kinds of heavy crackdowns and arrests of suspected terrorists, and I accentuate the word suspected in many cases here. The number of terrorist attacks has gone down in recent months. So it's not necessarily true that you need democracy to push back against terror. Bangladesh has pushed back against terror in an environment that's often lacking in democracy. But my point here is that if one is to generate any incentive whatsoever to convince the Trump White House to help restore democracy in Bangladesh, then there will need to be a terrorism rationale, but I'm not sure that's really there now. So let's just move the needle forward a bit. Let's suspend our disbelief for a moment and assume that the Trump administration is convinced that it needs to be seized of this matter of democracy in Bangladesh. Let's assume that it concludes that it's time to move forward and do something. Let's assume it concludes that eventually poor governance, undemocratic tendencies could provide the space for all kinds of terrorist problems that threaten the United States in a big way. And it's a fair assumption given that you have terror groups in the country, as you all know, that are linked to or claim to be loyal to the likes of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So let's assume the US decides it's time to roll up its sleeves and develop a strategy to try to get Bangladesh to democratize. The question here is there any way in the world that the US will succeed? Could the US actually compel Bangladesh to take actions that would strengthen democracy? Could the US convince Bangladesh to hold a free and fair election? Could the US convince the government to rein in its crackdowns on the opposition and on free media? My answer is a resounding no, or close to a resounding no. On the one hand, there could be some potential here, simply because there's grounds to believe that the government in Bangladesh is keen to work with Washington and to take it seriously. My understanding, though, you folks should correct me if I'm wrong, this sort of goes into the anecdotal gossipy space, is that there may have been a bit of bad blood between the Hasina government and the Obama administration. I've heard stories at the White House. The Obama White House withdrew the GSP preferences to Bangladesh, not necessarily because of concerns about labor rights, which is the publicly articulated reason, but rather because the Secretary of State at the time, Hillary Clinton, was unhappy that her good friend Mohammed Yunus had been removed as the head of chairman of Grameen Bank. Not my place to confirm or deny this story, but if there is some truth to it, one could assume that Dhaka would be predisposed to supporting Clinton's presidential candidate rival, Trump, and now to supporting President Trump. Now, you could argue on very superficial levels that there are perhaps some strategic convergences between the two leaders, Hasina and Trump. And they both claim to be very tough on terror, and both of them, to put it mildly, are inclined to use muscular measures against critics. That said, I would think that Trump's apparent snub of Hasina at the UN would really not reflect well on her view of him and his administration. But let's look at this another way. What leverage does the US have over Bangladesh? In Washington now, it's been very common to talk about the notion of leverage in the context of Pakistan. What about Bangladesh? What tools of influence, what forms of pressure could the US government take out of its policy toolkit, and would they work? At first blush, it would seem that Washington doesn't really have any leverage. As the US-Bangladesh relationship, it's a good relationship, but it's not a far-reaching strategic partnership. It's not like the US could threaten to withhold all kinds of arms shipments or cut off billions of dollars in assistance, because those things don't really exist. But if you think of it harder, then it may become clear that the US could perhaps enjoy some levers of leverage over Bangladesh. Whether they work is another matter. And you could look at some economic tools. The White House could dangle the possibility of restoring the GSP if Dhaka were to do X, Y, and Z to promote democracy, or if it were to hold an election that the US deems free and fair. I know that DACA had reason to believe that the GSP preferences would be reinstated, but in recent weeks it appears to have made a decision not to push the issue anymore. A more potent tool of leverage for the U.S. perhaps could be to try to exploit its status as a top destination for Bangladesh exports, and particularly clothing. Washington could threaten to slap higher tariffs on clothing exports or otherwise constrain market access to the U.S. This would be significant because when the Obama administration suspended those GSP privileges, that did not affect clothing exports, which are the top Bangladesh export to the U.S. It placed duties on other Bangladeshi exports to the U.S. So taxing clothing could perhaps be more consequential for Bangladesh's economy. Given Trump's protectionist proclivities, he may find this to be a desirable step to take. Now let's move into the security realm. The security partnership between the U.S. and Bangladesh is not particularly extensive, but there are some things there. There's a training exercise between U.S. Pacific Command and Bangladesh's Special Warfare Diving and Salvage Unit. It's a high-prestige activity. It helps burnish Bangladesh's geopolitical standing. If the U.S. threatened to cut it off until Bangladesh did more to democratize, then that could be an option. And there are other hypothetical options out there that the U.S. could take, though I think they'd be too drastic, not to mention pretty cruel and undesirable. For instance, if the U.S. were to try to limit the ability of non-resident Bangladeshis in the U.S. to remit money back to Bangladesh. Now, sure, I don't really think that would make much sense, given that the amount of remittances from the U.S. make up a small component of Bangladesh's economy. I think about 60% of Bangladesh remittances actually come from the Gulf. There could be efforts to try to slap sanctions or travel bans on Bangladeshi officials deemed to have been particularly egregious in terms of particular anti-democratic actions, or the U.S. could try to cut back some of its more visible U.S. aid programs in Bangladesh, so that would be pretty cruel. I don't think even a government as tough love oriented as the Trump one would dare to withdraw development aid, particularly if you're talking about things like cutting off funding to the Bangladesh Sesame Street. So where does this leave us? My point here is that the U.S. may have several economic and security-focused tools of leverage that it could attempt to wield, but they're two big Fs. One, would the Trump administration ever be focused enough on Bangladesh that it would consider utilizing them? And two, if it did use them, would they succeed, and would Bangladesh actually respond in ways that would help promote democracy? I think the answer to the first question depends on how much, if at all, the Trump administration would sign on to the terrorism rationale for engaging Bangladesh on the democracy issue. The answer to the second question is also tricky, and it comes down to basic issues of power, interests, reputation. And the current government in Bangladesh, as most governments, is concerned about power. It's curtailed democratic rights in great part to ensure its hold on power. If it were to relax those policies, that could undercut its power. If it were to allow more peaceful channels for dissent, if it were to hold a free and fair election, its hold on power could be loosened. It could ultimately be sent packing and voted out of power. So the question is, how important is it for the AL to maintain this power? How much of an interest does the AL have in safeguarding its power at all costs, and especially as this has an impact on its global reputation? To the extent that people in Washington and more broadly across the U.S. think about Bangladesh, there seems to be a pretty strong consensus that the Bangladesh government is really undercutting its reputation as a moderate state by resorting to these draconian political measures. Now, shouldn't that perception be important for Bangladesh? I mean, do you want potential foreign investors turned off by these unpleasant political things taking place? These aren't questions I can answer. I'd be curious to hear your take. But I think the whole notion of U.S. leverage working is really quite immaterial unless and until the government in Bangladesh is actually invested in the idea of supporting more democracy. And given the deep levels of political polarization and the deep enmity between the AL and the political opposition and the key leaders, I can't imagine that the government would be willing to open up channels of communication and promoting more democratic space, no matter what the U.S. may threaten to do. But hope maybe I'll be wrong. So I think there's relatively little the U.S. can do to help promote democracy in Bangladesh. Now, for all this talk of trying to use leverage, I just don't think the U.S. will try. All we can hope for is that the U.S. publicly calls on Bangladesh to hold a free and fair election, but then again, it's a message that may not be viewed with much credibility in Dhaka, given the U.S.'s own struggles with democracy. Another step we can perhaps hope for is that the U.S. would lean on India to push Bangladesh on democratization. India enjoys more policy space than does the U.S. to engage with Bangladesh. India may have more leverage too, given that it's a rising power neighbor of Bangladesh. Now, I was also asked to address what the UN could do to help restore democracy in Bangladesh. I'll be very brief here. I think we should keep our expectations low. It takes a whole lot to get an issue on the UN's agenda. Quite frankly, unless very bad and destabilizing things are happening in the context of democracy or lack thereof in Bangladesh, the UN probably won't raise a finger. You know, there are specific issues like human rights issues on which the UN will weigh in, and the Rohingya issue being an example. But the UN is not into democracy promotion. Now, the UN is about peace and security and territorial integrity and national sovereignty. It's not about imposing values on other countries like democracy. And incidentally, the term democracy does not appear anywhere in the UN Charter, so far as I know. You know, another factor that suggests the UN won't really push Bangladesh on the democracy front is the solid relationship between the UN and Bangladesh. Bangladesh, as you all know, has made very useful and substantive contributions to the UN. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Bangladesh supplies more troops than any other country in the world for UN peacekeeping missions. That's tremendous. So I don't know if there would be a desire on the part of the UN to rock the boat anymore that would need to be the case. So before I conclude, I'll just say a few words about human rights, and I'll just say a few things about the Rohingya issue, which is obviously a very salient matter. I know others will speak more than I on this. You know, you all know the basics, that the numbers are staggering. In recent weeks, at least 400,000 of them have fled into Bangladesh, a country that's already had several 100,000 Rohingya refugees there before the latest migrations. And there's nothing new about this. They've been coming since the 1970s. And back in the early 90s, you had a wave of about 250,000 coming in. The Rohingya issue is admittedly a very delicate and difficult policy dilemma for Dhaka. Given that Bangladesh is a poor country with one of the highest population densities in Asia, Dhaka is the most densely populated city in the world, I believe. So what to make of the Rohingya situation and what might await those who have arrived in recent weeks? And I think there are two possible trajectories here. One is pretty skeptical, the other is more hopeful. I'll start with the skeptical because I want to try to end on a positive note, because I haven't been very positive in everything else I've said. There's good reason to fear that the new arrivals could be persecuted under the guise of counterterrorism. The AL has cracked down quite viciously against the political opposition, including the Islamist political opposition, and accused it of staging terrorist attacks. In reality, as you all know, the rash of terrorist attacks suffered by Bangladesh in recent years is mainly the work of local terror groups like the JMB, Jamaat Mujahideen Bangladesh, with assistance perhaps from Al-Qaeda and ISIS. In recent months, Burmese media reports have claimed that Pakistani terror groups have recruited some Rohingya in Bangladesh. Additionally, in very recent days, Indian intelligence authorities have stated that LET has sought to recruit, Lashkar-e-Taiba has sought to recruit Rohingya refugees in India. Now, Rohingya do belong to a local insurgency known as ARSA, based in Burma, that targets the Burma regime. But so far as I know, and I was talking to someone in the audience before we started, so far as I know, there's little evidence that critical masses of the Rohingya community have gravitated to globally focused terrorist groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba. And yet, the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh may have to suffer for the sins of a small group of them that have turned to militancy, whether to ARSA or something beyond that. Now, the Rohingya entering Bangladesh could be scapegoated by a government that projects a very tough on terror image and has a very unfortunate track record of falsely implicating innocents in terrorism. I imagine that most of you read the very striking comments that came from Prime Minister Hasina's political advisor, Hassan Tawfiq Imam. They were very provocative. I think he was at a conference in India when he said these things. He spoke of ARSA as a common enemy of India and Bangladesh and Burma. He said that Rohingya separatism has been backed by Pakistan's ISI since 1969. And that he also said that the ISI was trying to use the Rohingya issue as a means of stoking communal unrest on the Bangladesh-Burma border. He said that ARSA has ties to LET, which is old news, but also to JMB, a local terror group, a Bangladesh terror group, which was news to me. He said that for humanitarian reasons, and only, quote, after initial reservations, did Bangladesh open its doors to the Rohingya. So these words don't inspire much confidence that the Rohingya will be treated particularly well by the government in Bangladesh. So that's a skeptical angle. But there may be a more hopeful one, although it's somewhat cynical from a political perspective. I talked earlier how the AL has been aligning itself with some of the religiously conservative positions of Hethasai. I think that's a political move. With elections scheduled for early 2019, the party will want to better position itself to win the votes of religious conservatives. And this new desire to take more conciliatory positions toward Islamist rivals could benefit the Rohingya in a big way, because Dhaka may believe that it can curry more favor from Islamists by throwing its weight behind a marginalized Muslim group like the Rohingya. And just in recent days, Prime Minister Hasina has launched something what I would describe as a charm offensive toward the Rohingya. She made a visit to meet with them in their camps, despite a lot of speculation that Rohingya in Bangladesh will be sent to this deserted island, ravaged by flooding and nearby pirates. Despite that, the government has announced that it will provide land to the Rohingya, and that's a big deal, given that this is a stateless and deeply disenfranchised community. And I think it also bears mentioning that the Bangladesh government is, to my knowledge, one of the only governments in the world that has actually used the word genocide to describe the violence against the Rohingyas in Rakhine State in Burma. I think the foreign minister in Bangladesh used that term. Not to overstate the possibility of a better lot for the Rohingya in Bangladesh anytime soon. I mean, the community that struggled to secure land, education, and dignity for so long can't expect its plight to magically improve overnight. And you could argue that once the media recedes and the world forgets about the Rohingya once again, Dhaka could well quietly walk back some gestures of support. And at the end of the day, Dhaka has made no secret of its desire that Burma should take back the Rohingya going into Bangladesh. But at any rate, in conclusion, even modest and short-lived efforts to assist the Rohingya are a major improvement over what they've been subjected to in recent years across the various homelands they've adopted. So anyway, I'll end right there on a positive note before I'm tempted to lapse back into the negative, but thanks.
ITV, Call of Peace, Save Humanity.